debate. Oh, we're live. Okay. Welcome to the Capturing Christianity CCv1 debate on God's existence. And you can hear my voice is kind of going. I've got some cough drops. I'm going to have cough drops like the whole night. And so please just don't mind that. I will be opening rappers. I'll try to keep my talking to a minimum so you don't have to hear my raspy voice. But I want to go ahead and welcome up Phil Talon. Is he here? There he is, Phil. He is one of our sponsors from HBU, and he has a couple things that he wants to say to kick us off, and then we'll go ahead and get started directly into the debate. You already have a microphone? Yeah, we've got a video. Yeah, just tell him what you need.
Yeah, roll that video.
I'm Phil Talon, Dean of the School of Christian Thought here at HBU. I've written some books, have a family, and I want to help prepare you for ministry. Ministry is a marathon. It's a long obedience in the same direction. And you can't run a marathon without training first. You need to know your Bible well to empower your preaching. You need to grow deeper in your faith, and you need supervised hands-on ministry experience. Our BA to MDiv program is designed for undergraduates who come in as freshmen and leave 5 years later with a Master's of Divinity. And here's the thing. Normally, a BA and an MDiv will take you at least 8 years, if not more. But here at HBU, in an intense 5 years, you'll complete a bachelor's in Christianity and a master's that's focused on preparing you to serve full-time. You'll study with our team of Bible scholars and church leaders who will challenge and guide you, and you'll do it in a cost-effective way. If you want to find out more, follow the link below.
That was the best and the worst thing I've ever seen. That was awesome.
I made that video because I was trying to be as cool as Cameron Bertuzzi, and that was silly because it's not possible. And I'm happy to fail that. So I'm Phil Talon. I'm Dean of the School of Christian Thought at HBU, and we're very happy to be here and to help to sponsor this wonderful conference. If you're interested in finding out more, going further in your education, if you've got someone who's thinking about coming to HBU for undergrad or grad, we'd love to talk to you. We've got a table over by the book stall, and someone will be there all weekend. Her name is Sydney, and you can talk to her. So if you're thinking about, if you're an undergrad thinking about coming and studying, perhaps pursuing this BA to MDiv, or if you're interested in our graduate programs in divinity or in apologetics, we have courses available here in the heart of Houston. We're not too far down the road. We're also available online. And we're starting a Doctor of Ministry. It's a new program for us that has one focus in New Testament and another in cultural apologetics. So if that's something that you're thinking about to refresh and enrich your ministry, please come study with us. One thing that might be of interest to you all is that this fall, William Lane Craig is going to be on campus. He's going to be leading a one-week intensive on the quest for the historical Adam, presenting some new research that he's doing. So that'll be October 25th through 29th in the afternoon on campus, and that's available to anybody in the community. You can come in and survey, and there's information that's available over at the booth. And you can also watch that through Zoom. You can participate just like you're a student, ask questions, and get a chance to learn from Dr. Craig about some of his new research. Thanks so much for having me.
So he's going to be there on Zoom?
He's going to be there in person, so he'll be on campus.
Oh my goodness!
Teaching, but then we'll also be streaming it out so people who are at a distance
can
also
was this?
participate. October 25th through 29th.
I need to look at this. I'm serious.
Yeah, we can see about getting you a discount.
This is really cool. Yeah, I think you were mentioning to me that this is the first time he's actually taught a class on this, right?
Yeah, so this is new material that he's presenting. So he's just gone through kind of a long period of study, and a new book of his is coming out, so this is going to be the first time that a lot of people are going to be getting to kind of hear his full research.
That's super cool. All right, Phil Talon, everybody.
Yeah, thank you very much.
HBU, go check him out. All right, at this time, I would like to invite up our debaters. So Trent Horn and Benjamin Blake Speed Watkins. I got to make sure I say your whole name. Come on up, guys. So you can have a seat just as I'll just kind of let everyone know what we're going to do tonight. It's on your handout, so 15-minute openings, 7-minute first rebuttal. This is super weird. I need to stop. I have never been participated in a live debate, so this is really cool for me. I'm moderating it, obviously, but I don't know. This is pretty cool. This is cool. Okay, weirdness out of the way. All right, 15-minute opening, 7-minute first rebuttal. I'm going to be timing this on my phone. 5-minute second rebuttal, 30-minute moderated dialogue. I'll try to keep my talking again to a minimum. Then we're going to do 30 minutes of Q&A. We're going to set up microphones here and here. I'll let you know where to go if you want to ask a question. And then 5-minute closings. So that's going to be the format of the debate. And we're debating the topic, does God exist? So in the affirmative is Trent Horn. Let's go ahead and just have you come on up here.
Get our microphone. Okay, can you hear me now? Yes. All right. And before we get started, yes, Cameron, I'm sorry that you have a cough. I still have shingles in my left eye. Ben, if you want to disclose your medical history, you're free to do that in your opening. Right. Let's see. And then let me get this up here. All right. Well, thank you so much, Cameron, and thank you, Ben. Thank you so much for being here as well. We can all agree, at least, it's nice to finally do this kind of stuff in person. So let me start by saying that God is not a being in the universe. What I'm arguing for tonight, I'm arguing for that God just is unlimited being itself. God is not something that we locate with scientific tools, because God is not composed of matter and energy. Neither is God located within time and space. That doesn't mean the game's over, though, because philosophers know lots of things could exist or do exist beyond the reach of science. This includes minds, numbers, propositions, free will, and objective moral truths. In fact, I listened to an interview that Ben did recently where he defends the existence of objective moral truths, or moral realism, and I felt a common bond in hearing him make this case. For example, the philosopher Dan Barras says that moral realism is no better than theism, because neither can be proven scientifically. The atheistic philosopher J.L. Mackie, in fact, said of moral facts, they are unlikely to have arisen in the ordinary course of events without an all-powerful God to create them. So I feel for Ben that no scientific fact proves moral realism, just like no scientific fact proves theism. Instead, you have to guide people's intuitions towards the only conclusion that makes sense of the world around us. So let me offer some observations of the world around us based on our strongest intuitions and show you how they point towards God as the ultimate cause of the world. First, I'll offer what has been called the argument from motion or change. It goes like this. 1, change exists. 2, change involves the actualization of a potential. This could be intrinsic change like growth or extrinsic change like movement. But whatever it is, change is the result of a thing's potential being actualized, such as liquid water's potential to be solid when it's actualized by cold air. 3, no potential can actualize itself. 4, any change is caused by something actual. The point here is that no potential X can become an actual Y on its own any more than water could just freeze itself or a train car could propel itself. Instead, something like a freezer or a locomotive must actualize the potential for change in these objects. 5, anything that is changing has its potential for existence actualized by something else. And 6, there can't be an infinite chain of actualizers. So the impossibility of such an infinite series is explained by the philosopher Garrigou-Lagrange, who once wrote, "To do away with a supreme cause is to claim that, as someone has said, a brush will paint by itself, provided it has a very long handle." In his discussion of St. Thomas Aquinas, who this argument is based on, the atheist J.H. Sobel writes, "I am persuaded by it that sustaining causes could not go on to infinity." What this means is that causes which are concurrent with each other cannot be infinite, because if there would be no cause at all. This series of causes would be like an infinitely long train of boxcars without a locomotive. Such a train, even infinitely long, would have no motion to it, unless you added a car that gives motion to the train without receiving motion from anything else. 7, therefore, there must be a first actualizer. 8, this first actualizer could not have any potential And so it must be an unactualized actualizer, or that which is pure act. Since an infinite regress of concurrent causes is impossible, the first cause must not rely on anything else to actualize its own potential to exist. In that respect, it must be pure existence or pure actuality itself. Moreover, this cause could not have any other potentialities, because like everything else we observe, what the cause does follows from what it is. And what it is at its most basic level is existence or actuality itself. To say this first actualizer has perfect existence, but another part of it doesn't exist, or it only exists potentially, would be a contradiction. 9, if something is pure act, it would be God. 10, therefore, God exists. All right, so why should we believe something with pure act has the classical divine attributes? For example, we know if it's pure act, there could only be one purely actual actualizer. If there was more than one, in order to distinguish them, each actualizer would lack something the other had. But this would cause each of them to have potentials, which they can't have if they're purely actual. Also, if there was more than one purely actual being, they would have to exist in a common framework that's more fundamental than either of them. And so neither could be pure actuality. In addition, change only happens when potential is reduced to actual. But this final cause is just pure actuality. So as a result, it can't change. And because time is how we measure change, it follows the cause cannot be subject to time, so it must be timeless. We also know that matter is always changing, at least on the atomic and subatomic levels. And so this cause can't be composed of matter. The cause must also be unlimited because a limit would entail a potential which the thing in question could never actualize. That means the cause's causal power couldn't be limited. It couldn't have a potential for action that it couldn't actualize. So if the cause is unlimited in power, it would be all-powerful. This cause also can't go out of existence because going from existing to not existing is a temporal and changeable process. And this cause is timeless and changeless. In fact, in being pure actuality, this cause would have no potential for non-existence, so it couldn't fail to exist. So this argument shows there's one unlimited, purely actual cause that exists beyond time and space. That's expected on theism, but very surprising on atheism. Also keep in mind there are only two kinds of entities that exist: concrete ones, like 2 toy blocks, and abstract ones, like the number 2 or the shape of a cube. But unlike concrete objects, abstract objects like numbers and shapes don't have causal power. So the cause of the universe can't be an abstract object like a number that is causally effete. Instead, it has to be some kind of concrete object. But the cause is also an immaterial concrete object. And the only immaterial causal realities we know of are the intentions of an agent. So the cause must be personal rather than impersonal. Another clue that points to God is the fact that the universe came into existence in the finite past from a state of nothingness. One reason to think the universe began in this manner is because causal chains that terminate in an effect in the present cannot be infinite into the past. This can be seen in a thought experiment called Hilbert's Hotel. If the past were infinite, then a builder could construct one room of a hotel every year. I'll bring up my little builders here. Note some of them wear masks. So the builder could construct one room of a hotel every year in the past that also produces an immortal guest who lives in that room. And by today, if the past were infinite, the hotel would have an infinite number of rooms that are fully occupied. But while you can have things like infinite numbers, infinite sets, and imaginary numbers in the abstract realm of mathematics, you can't have these things in the real world. The mathematicians Edward Kasner and James Newman write, "The infinite certainly does not exist in the same sense that we say there are fish in the sea. Existence in the mathematical sense is wholly different from the existence of objects in the physical world." So, for example, in transfinite arithmetic, subtracting infinite quantities is undefined and prohibited in the same way you can't divide by 0. But at Hilbert's Hotel, nothing stops every guest from checking out, or every guest in the even-numbered rooms from checking out, or every guest after room number 4. But if this happened, then a different amount of guests would remain in the hotel each time, even though an identical amount, or infinite, would have been subtracted each time, which is a mathematical no-no. Guests checking in would also be a problem. Even if the hotel were full, remember, every year a room is built and an immortal guest checks into the room. But even if the hotel were full, you could always accommodate new guests by shifting all the occupants over to the next room. And so this infinitely occupied hotel could accommodate an infinite number of new guests. It would have a sign that says, "No vacancy, room's always ready for you." And it gets worse. Back to my cute construction men. Imagine that as the rooms in Hilbert's hotel were constructed, each worker received a piece of paper from the worker who built the previous room the previous year. If the paper is blank, the worker writes the number of the room he just constructed on it. But if the paper already has a room number on it, then he just passes that piece of paper on to the guy building next year's room. Now here's the question. What is the number? What number is written on the paper given to the worker building this year's room? There has to be some number written on the paper, because if it were blank, then the worker who built last year's room in 2020 would have written that room number on it. But the paper couldn't have been blank last year, because the guy who built the room in 2019 would have written his room number on it, and so on. If the process continues forever into the past, we have a paradox. There is a piece of paper that arrives in the present that must have some room number on it, but it can't have any particular room number on it. This leads to a simple argument. If an infinite past is possible, then Hilbert's hotel is possible. Hilbert's hotel is not possible. Therefore, an infinite past is not possible. Moreover, if the past is finite, the universe would have begun to exist from a state of nothing. However, many atheists say they'd believe in God if they saw something like an amputated limb healed through prayer, or a limb from nothing. This means they would pick a divine explanation for a limb from nothing rather than no explanation at all. But if our universe came into being from nothing just as inexplicably as a healed, amputated limb, then atheists should be consistent and conclude the universe has a divine cause as well. Finally, there are features of morality that don't make sense if morality isn't ultimately grounded in the perfectly good God of classical theism. Let me review 3 of those features. Number 1, human equality. In his debate with Dr. Christopher Kaiser on abortion, Ben said that it is not human beings that have equal rights. Instead, only persons have equal rights. And according to him, personhood does not begin in human beings until several weeks after birth. Ben and other philosophers like Peter Singer concede infanticide would be permissible under this view, but it might be restricted on prudential grounds. However, even pro-choice philosophers like Jeff McMahon say grounding our equal worth in unequal cognitive abilities causes human equality to, in McMahon's words, rest on distressingly insecure foundations. Equal possession of a human nature explains equal moral worth, however. Now, that leads to another question. Why does having a certain kind of DNA make us more valuable than other animals? That leads to moral feature number 2, human exceptionalism. In his debate with Dr. Kaiser, Ben expressed concerns about speciesism, which is supposed to be an evil like racism. Under this view, saying one species is more valuable than another in virtue of DNA would be as bigoted as saying one race of humans is more valuable than another race of humans because of their DNA. But nearly everyone agrees it would be moral to feed a pig to your starving child and monstrous to do the opposite. Atheism leads to the conclusion that species membership is morally irrelevant. But theism can explain why only human animals have intrinsic value. As it has been said before, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Finally, there's number 3, human evils. By human evils, I mean those acts which aren't just bad like a drought. I'm talking about evils that only humans can commit. A tiger might be a cunning killer, but only humans can be cruel killers who disregard a moral law they ought to follow. Once again, if humans are just another species who act in accord with physical laws, then there is no reason to assume they have moral responsibility, including the responsibility to not commit certain intrinsic evils that are always wrong, no matter what kind of good they might accomplish. Atheism cannot explain why there are some things we must never do, such as actively killing infants who have mild disabilities, even if such an act produced net utility. It also can't explain why we are morally responsible for our actions if we do perform these evil acts. However, if God created human beings to freely obey moral laws that reflect our equal intrinsic value, then this makes sense of our moral experience. And God would just be the ultimate standard of goodness, and morality would reflect his perfect nature. The atheistic philosopher Robin Lepoidevin puts it this way: unlike humans, God is a source of moral value. That is, God's goodness in part consists of the fact that he is the basis of ethics. Since it is not trivial that God plays such a role, it cannot be trivial that God is good. In fact, it is highly morally significant because it points to the source of moral obligation. So that's Robin Lepoidevin, who wrote a great atheist introduction to philosophy of religion. Finally, badness or evil are not positive things. They are privations of the good a thing ought to have. But if the cause of the universe has no potential and is pure actuality, then it must be good by definition. That's because it could not lack anything, and so it couldn't be bad in any sense of that word. In fact, when all of these arguments are seen as a whole, they form a strong case that there is a changeless, timeless, immaterial, infinite, necessarily existing, all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good cause of the universe, or what most people refer to as God. Thank you.
Check, check. Y'all can hear me, right? Good. Are you ready?
Yes. Gotcha.
Okay. I want to start off tonight by sincerely thanking Cameron Bertuzzi for inviting me to the first Capturing Christianity conference, and Trent Horn for agreeing to have this debate with me on such short notice. I'm looking forward to some exciting and engaging exchanges, and with any luck, we might just be able to resolve some deep disagreements. The focus of my case will center around the concepts of evidence and probability. I will present at least one argument from experience and two arguments that are a priori against Trent's particular classical theist view. But much of what I say will also apply to theism more broadly. I have a good deal to cover, so let's get started. Before I get to my arguments, though, I need to characterize some concepts. I will be defending naturalism, understood as the hypothesis the universe is self-contained or causally closed, such that there are no supernatural causes. Natural reality exhausts causal reality. This conception entails the universe is indifferent towards the nature and condition of sentient life. What I'll call perfect being theism, or sometimes theism for short, is the view there is a perfect and personal being who is the omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect creator of the universe. Trent is also a classical theist, so I will understand classical theism as entailing perfect being theism and making at least 4 additional distinctive claims about the nature of God. God is simple, immutable, timeless, and impassible. I want to now characterize the concept of evidence that will be crucial to my case. We can understand evidence as an observation that probabilistically favors the truth of some proposition. According to the law of likelihood, some observation is evidence for hypothesis H1 rather than hypothesis H2, if and only if the likelihood of the observation given H1 is greater than the likelihood of the observation given H2. My broad strategy in the philosophy of religion is to let evidential chips fall where they may, and then proportion our beliefs to the evidence. For my case tonight, I will begin by making an argument from simplicity. I will show naturalism is more coherent and modest than theism, and is thus the more simple explanation. Next, I'll defend a cumulative argument from imperfection, where I show particular facts come together to provide decisive evidence for naturalism over theism. Finally, I will be offering what I call the argument from freedom, where I show there is an internal coherence problem within classical theism. To help illustrate my arguments, we can borrow from Paul Draper and think of both naturalism and theism as being in a race to the finish line, which represents the best explanation on the total evidence. The argument from simplicity claims naturalism starts out ahead in the race before we even consider the evidence because of theism's lower prior probability. The cumulative argument from imperfection claims naturalism outpaces theism with respect to the total evidence. And finally, the argument from freedom claims there are some internal tensions within classical theism that threaten its coherency and thus has the possibility of pushing it out of the race before it even begins. There is a method in epistemology known as inference to the best explanation. Perhaps an inference to the best explanation is the one that is most probable given some observation. There's also a well-known theorem of probability known as Bayes' theorem that allows us to infer that some set of facts is evidence for a hypothesis on our total evidence rather than another using the ratios of likelihood comparisons known as the Bayes factor and the prior probabilities of the hypotheses. This evidential method is known as Bayesianism. However, it is going to require me to say something about the prior probabilities of naturalism and theism. This brings me to my first argument tonight. Naturalism has a higher prior probability than theism because naturalism is simpler. My premise A claims simpler hypotheses have higher prior probabilities because they have fewer ways of being false. Premise B claims simplicity is determined by modesty and coherence because the less modest a hypothesis is, the more ways it has to be false. Additionally, the less coherent a hypothesis is, the more tensions arise, so it also has more ways to be false. Premise C claims naturalism is more modest than theism because naturalism asserts fewer fundamental features of reality. It might be objected that theism is more modest because it is supremely simple. I explicitly reject this claim because it does not consider my premise D, the coherence of classical theism, which is notorious for having problems of coherency. For example, according to the doctrine of analogy, any claim about God we make in personal terms will always be inadequate because God is only analogously personal. These problems of coherency are only made worse when we consider Trent's other theological beliefs cast in personal terms, such as the Trinity being three persons in one, or the idea that an eternal God came into time to suffer and die. I don't really know how Trent squares coming into time with timelessness, nor the death and suffering of Jesus with impassibility and immutability. I argue these problems of coherency count against theism's prior probability. It might be objected these issues of coherency can be resolved by making additional claims, but doing so comes at the cost of modesty. The classical theist faces a dilemma. In being modest, the classical theist faces a problem of coherency. In being more coherent, the classical theist faces a problem of modesty. Either way, conclusion F follows. Classical theism's prior probability is low. Moving on now from prior probability, how do the evidential chips from experience fall for theism? That brings me to my next argument and my most important one, the argument from imperfection. The imperfections we observe are evidence against theism because the probability of observing them given perfect being theism is zero. We can only confer this probability on this observation if we make assumptions about perfect being theism and perfection more broadly. Those assumptions are given by my premise G. A perfect creator could not create anything less than a perfect universe. If it's conceded that H, the universe, contains imperfection, then conclusion I follows. There is no perfect creator of the universe. We might be tempted to deny G, but that premise is entailed by God's omnipotence and moral perfection. The actions of a perfect being cannot decrease the degree of perfection of the universe as a whole in any possible world. And that claim entails premise G. Premise G, then, is necessarily true. Premise H is the only contingent premise we can deny. Why think the universe contains imperfections such that the universe is worse than it would be? What sort of observation probabilistically counts as evidence against theism? It is to these questions that I now turn. According to the argument from hiddenness, there is an observation that proves there is no perfect being because we can deduce this conclusion from the observation given by premise K. There are some non-resistant non-theists. These are people like me, who no longer believe, or maybe never have ever believed, there is a perfect being. And this lack of belief is not the result of emotional or behavioral opposition towards God. God's perfect love implies he would always be open to a relationship such that every finite person believes God exists unless they are somehow resisting such a belief, because a belief that God exists is a necessary condition for a meaningful relationship. It cannot be the case that we are in a relationship with someone unless we also believe that they exist. Therefore, premise J follows. Perfect being theism implies there are no non-resistant non-theists. Consequently, conclusion L follows. There is no perfect being. How might other observations justify the claim the universe contains imperfections that are evidence against theism? According to evidential arguments from evil, there are observations about evil that show theism is false, all things considered. These observations include general facts about the kinds, amounts, and distributions of evils in the world, and particular facts about evil, like children who suffer from cancer, fawns that die in forest fires, and Holocaust victims who suffer horrendously. Premise M claims God's perfection rules out unjustified evils as imperfections. So why believe Premise N that claims there are such imperfections as unjustified evils? I will argue we can justify Premise N using an inductive method and the moral assumption that the world is, on the whole, imperfect unless all its wrong-making properties are sufficiently counterbalanced by right-making properties, both known and unknown. We'll let N be God's allowance of any seemingly unjustified evil or imperfection, R any unknown right-making property, and W any unknown wrong-making property, such that there are only 4 possible outcomes for any particular N. In 3 of these 4 possibilities, N is an unjustified evil, all things considered, because it has wrong-making characteristics that are not counterbalanced by its right-making characteristics. So it is 3 times as likely any particular N is an unjustified evil. Supposing there may be some right-making and wrong-making properties unknown to us, the atheist philosopher Michael Tooley shows the probability all these evils are actually morally justified to allow, all things considered, must be less than 1 over n plus 1. Because n is a very large number, the probability it is morally permissible to allow all these evils is extremely small. Thus, we have inductively justified premise n, that there are probably some unjustified evils, all things considered. Therefore, my conclusion O follows. Theism is probably false, all things considered. How else are evils evidence for imperfections? I claimed at the start I'd be defending naturalism, but so far that hypothesis has been relegated to the sidelines. It's time to bring that hypothesis into the game to see what it has to say about observed evils. Recall, naturalism entails the universe is indifferent to the nature and conditions of sentient life. Using likelihood comparisons, I argue there are at least 3 evolutionary observations about evil that are more likely given naturalism than theism. First, according to what I'll call the evolutionary languishing of sentient beings, for hundreds of millions of years, biological organisms have experienced mostly profound languishing, predation, starvation, and disease. Secondly, 99% of all species that have ever lived are now extinct, and the state of nature is locked in a savage struggle for survival over limited resources. Finally, according to personal tragedy, some lose themselves entirely by coming to believe their lives are, on the whole, no longer worth living. Another interesting point about all these observations is that they are straightforward physical implications of the second law of thermodynamics. According to this law of nature, entropy, or the measure of disorder in the universe, is always increasing because there are more ways for things to be disordered than to be ordered. There are many more ways for animals to suffer than for them to experience pleasure, many ways for life to languish than to flourish, and many more ways for us to experience tragedy than triumph. Naturalism predicts this kind of thermodynamic indifference towards sentient life. However, given Trent's classical theism, these are neither accidental nor unfortunate byproducts of an intentionally designed process, but are rather the very clockwork of the process itself. This is the divine means by which God intentionally chose to bring about the goal of finite creatures through his creative act. So God actively employed gratuitous pain, languishing, and tragedy in his providential production of humanity for hundreds of millions of years. This is really surprising. Using these likelihood functions to formulate the Bayes factor and using the prior probabilities from my first argument, we can now formulate a Bayesian argument from evil. This argument is going to argue on our total evidence and claim that evolutionary evils and the previous evils that I also mentioned are evidence for naturalism rather than theism, all things considered. In my first argument, I had mentioned classical theism faces problems of coherency, affecting its prior probability. Now I want to look at another a priori argument that further challenges its coherency. According to the argument from freedom, God's immutability is incompatible with perfect freedom. Premise S claims God is immutable or purely actual, and premise T claims whatever is purely actual is devoid of any potentialities. Therefore, conclusion U, God is devoid of any potentialities. It's also true by definition that V, a will devoid of any potentialities, is also devoid of any contingencies. Premise W, a will devoid of any contingencies, could not have done otherwise. Premise X, a will that could not have done otherwise, is not perfectly free. Therefore, conclusion Y, God is not perfectly free. However, premise Z claims perfect being theism implies that by definition, God is perfectly free. Therefore, conclusion AA follows. The conjunction of perfect being theism and classical theism is impossible. It's important to notice this entire argument is analytic, meaning that all of its premises are true by definition. These pieces of classical theism do not coherently fit well together. In conclusion, I've made at least 3 important claims. First, I argue naturalism has a higher prior probability than theism because it's simpler. I argue this is because naturalism is more modest and coherent than theism. Second, I claim the imperfections in the universe are evidence against theism. I cash this evidential claim out in at least 4 probabilistic ways. Non-resistant non-theists prove theism is false. Particular facts about evils are evidence theism is probably false, all things considered. Evolutionary evils are more likely given naturalism than theism, and facts about evolutionary evils are evidence for naturalism over theism, all things considered. My last claim was an a priori argument about the coherency of Trent's classical theism, where I showed God's immutability is incompatible with his perfect freedom. I think all of these lines of reasoning taken together give us powerful evidential reasons for thinking Trent's classical theism is false, and something like my naturalism is closer to the truth. Thank you.
All right, we're going to turn to rebuttals. First rebuttal, 7 minutes. And Trent, whenever you start talking, I will start my timer.
All right.
From there, just a quick reminder, we're going to do first rebuttal, 7 minutes, 5 minutes, second rebuttals, dialogue after that, Q&A after that, and then closings. So 7-minute first rebuttal, whenever you're ready.
Sure. Well, thank you, Ben, for that opening statement. Here's some thoughts. We'll talk about low probability. Ben's definition of naturalism seemed to only be the negation of the supernatural. But any specific explanation is going to have a lower intrinsic probability than the mere negation of an explanation. For example, the intrinsic probability Jones killed Smith is lower than the negation that anything else killed Smith. But it doesn't follow that the most probable explanation, therefore, is that no specific thing killed Smith. In the same vein, we shouldn't follow this reasoning and think the most intrinsically probable explanation for the universe is no specific explanation at all. Second, Paul Draper defines naturalism as the physical preceding the mental, and supernaturalism as the mental preceding the physical. Draper then says, naturalism and supernaturalism are equally probable intrinsically because they are equally modest and coherent. So if theism makes supernaturalism more likely because its added facts provide ultimate explanations and are more coherent, then theism's intrinsic probability is not hindered when compared to naturalism. Third, if something obtains in more possible worlds, it has a higher intrinsic probability. For example, the claim there is a cat outside my door is more probable than the claim there is a pink cat outside my door, because the former claim, which includes black and white cats, along with pink ones, obtains in more possible worlds. Now, theism holds that God is necessary, or God exists in every possible world, whereas minimal naturalism makes no such claim about the universe. And so this increases theism's intrinsic probability in relation to naturalism. Also, when it comes to the evidence of sentient life languishing, well, under naturalism, we would expect that there would be no sentient life at all when we hear about the research related to the fine-tuning of the universe. So the existence of a possible world where there is sentient life at all actually points back towards theism. Finally, if simplicity increases probability, then an appeal to the infinite, undivided, and absolutely simple God of classical theism increases theism's intrinsic probability. Also, naturalism is not as simple as Ben makes it out to be, because it must posit things like brute facts and fundamental particles to explain the existence of the universe if it's going to be more than a mere negation of the supernatural. So one could argue naturalism is not simpler than theism. Ben gave an argument from imperfection, that if there was a perfect universe, if God is a perfect creator, there would be a perfect universe. To me, a perfect universe is as incoherent as a best possible world. There is no maximum a universe can reach where it becomes perfect or it becomes a best possible world. Ben and I can both tell you what a perfect creator looks like, all-knowing, all-powerful, necessarily exists. But if a perfect world is possible, I would like Ben to tell us what it looks like. And then finally, he gave us an argument from evil, because I bet I could think of a more perfect one. an argument, so let's look at the argument from evil. Very few atheists claim that evil logically disproves God's existence. Paul Draper, who Ben has been drawing from in tonight's opening, says, quote, "Theists face no serious logical problem of evil. As a result, atheistic philosophers try to zero in on particular evils that make God's existence less likely and not illogical. But there are problems with this. First, by narrowing the evils, Ben tacitly acknowledges there could be reasons for some of them, like moral evils are justified by free will. But if we can see God has reasons for some evils, why shouldn't we presume he has reasons for all of them then? Second, anything God creates will be limited because only God is unlimited. So under theism, we shouldn't be surprised that anything God creates, especially something that is material, will have competing goods and shifting limits among creatures so that certain goods and absence or privation of the good might obtain when they're created. Also, this argument isn't really about hundreds of millions of years of evolution. It's more about whether God is justified in making sentient beings that are prone to decay. And Ben kind of assumed God has no good reasons for this, but I think there's good reasons. Here's a few. One, creating animals that don't feel pain seems as unfeasible as making humans that don't have free will. God can make human puppets that look free, and he can make animal robots that look like they have animal instincts, but if they don't feel pain, they're not really animals. They're not responding in an animal-like way. God chose to allow humans to morally develop in a process that creates unique goods and evils, so God chose animals to biologically develop so that unique goods and evils would exist. Two, the very existence of animals may justify suffering that they endure. For example, most people wouldn't think it wrong for humans to terraform a planet in the solar system and create sentient life, knowing that it will languish. Also, we would be fine to leave the Earth and not destroy it if we wanted to go colonize a new planet. But if humans can create or allow animal suffering to continue because it is good that animals exist, why can't God do the same? Three, if sentient animals have a sense of self, enduring sense, they might be compensated in the afterlife. If they don't have an enduring sense of self over time, this makes the problem of their suffering much less pressing. When it comes to the evil of non-belief in God, just as God gives us a long leash when it comes to making moral mistakes, even grave ones, so that we can have certain goods like free will, the theist would say it makes sense that God gives us a long leash to make epistemic mistakes, so that certain goods could obtain, like freely choosing God. But if God can bring greater goods from evil, then that evil can be justified. And in fact, I don't think it'd be obvious everyone believes God exists. I think consciousness and free will and temporal becoming are obvious, but there's many philosophers who don't believe those things exist. So if God were as obvious as those things, people still might not believe in him. Finally, probabilistic arguments, they're misleading because you got to have all the background knowledge, not just the things that make things less likely, but all the stuff that makes it even more likely. A 600-pound person is probably not an athlete, but if they're a world-class sumo wrestler, oh, now you've changed all the background knowledge to reach a different conclusion. Finally, when it comes to free will, Ben's argument is ambiguous. When he says God is devoid of potentialities, classical theists agree God has no passive potentiality. He can have active potentiality. Nothing affects God, but God can refrain from affecting other things, like letting the dinosaurs have another million years. Premise W says a will devoid of any contingencies could not have done otherwise. This is a fallacy of accident because it compares the divine will to the human will. Human wills are in time and limited and have to do discursive reasoning. God is timeless and all-knowing and does not have to process things in the same way, so we would not expect God's will to achieve different results to have any kind of intrinsic contingency. So I think I've shown Ben's arguments do not prove God doesn't exist, and in my next rebuttal, I will answer Ben's objections to my case for God. Thank you.
Thank you, Trent, for that first rebuttal. You ready? Trent makes a cumulative case for classical theism with an argument from motion, supported by arguments for causal finitism and a moral argument. I will respond to these considerations in order. I'll start with the argument for motion. First, Trent's argument makes a crucial assumption. He assumes the existence of some substance at time t presupposes the concurrent actualization of its potential for its existence. Let's call this the sustaining causation thesis. I believe naturalists have no good reason to accept this. First, we can follow J.H. Sobel, who Trent quoted earlier tonight, in pointing out that there is no justification for thinking that something is being moved from potential to actual with respect to its existence. Change is evident to the senses, but a concurrent actualization of something's existence is by no means evident to the senses. Yet the existence of such a per se chain is precisely what Trent's argument needs to succeed. The thesis of existential inertia can account for all the data that Trent appeals to. Second, Trent's argument relies on the distinction between essence and existence. Trent is assuming existence is not an intrinsic feature of a thing's essence. A naturalist can simply reject this assumption on the grounds of metaphysical simplicity. We can say that 1, the universe does not contain non-existent essences, and 2, existence can be an intrinsic feature of all essences. This is a simpler model that offers a rebutting defeater to Trent's assumption. The second objection I want to mention we can call the quantifier shift fallacy. Even granting Trent's assumptions, it does not follow that there is a single, unique, unactualized actualizer. Just as it does not follow there's a single, unique counselor for all students from the fact that for each such student, he or she has a counselor, it likewise does not follow there's a first cause of all per se chains from the fact that for each such chain, it has a single, unactualized actualizer. Even if things have per se efficient causes, there is no obvious reasons why all things must have the same first per se efficient cause. Let's now turn to Trent's second cosmological argument, his argument from causal finitude. By asking a series of questions, Trent infers the divine attributes of the God of classical theism. For the sake of time, let's suppose the universe really is past finite. Does this get us to classical theism? I will argue it does not. First, Trent asks whether the cause of the universe can change or is temporal. If God begins to be related to creation, then God changes. This follows from the doctrine of creation ex nihilo. If God changes, then he is neither immutable nor timeless. Therefore, the doctrine of creation ex nihilo implies God is neither immutable nor timeless. This is an undercutting defeater to Trent's point. Next, Trent also asks if the cause of the universe is limited. I think this is the best place to mention the bane of all cosmological and even teleological arguments, including the prior argument from motion. According to what I'll call the gap problem, neither of these arguments give us any moral information. These arguments cannot undercut, even in principle, an argument from evil and imperfection. So long as that argument is still on the table and we have reasons to think those arguments are sound, Trent's arguments cannot succeed. Thirdly, Trent asks, is the cause of the universe necessary? I doubt this. A necessary cause of the universe leads to modal collapse. If X is caused by something necessary, then that necessary cause entails X. However, a necessary cause will entail other necessities. This leads to modal fatalism, and Trent's causal finitude can't bridge the gap between contingency and necessity. Trent also asks if the cause of the universe is personal. Trent rules out a material cause for the universe, but all known mental activity has a physical basis in material brains. This provides inductive support for the view there are no mental changes without any material changes. That claim is an undercutting defeater for inferring a personal mind that is the cause of the universe. Also, consider my prior arguments from hiddenness and evil here. Finally, Trent asks if the cause of the universe is good. Even if we suppose the universe is finite and has a cause, the arguments from evil and imperfection are rebutting defeaters for inferring a good cause of the universe. Again, here we see the gap problem. Now I want to say something about Trent's moral arguments. I'm an atheist and a moral realist. My view implies basic moral truths are necessary truths, meaning they are true in all possible worlds. It's impossible pain is in itself good, or that persons do not have intrinsic value. Basic moral truths are true in all possible worlds, so they are not evidence for either naturalism or theism. This claim is a rebutting defeater for all of Trent's moral arguments. But I want to also say something about my moral view. So I believe that some things matter in a moral sense because there are reasons for everyone to care about them. Some reasons are also moral reasons because they are stronger than any other competing reasons we may have. Truths about moral reasons do not have any ontologically weighty implications, meaning they do not imply the existence of anything other than themselves, because basic moral truths are irreducibly normative, meaning they cannot be restated in purely non-normative terms. This gives me all the conceptual framework I need to affirm things like moral values. Justice requires us to treat similar cases alike. Prudence requires we have equal concern for all parts of our lives, and benevolence requires us to treat the good of any other as much as their own. This also helps me understand moral wrongness or moral responsibilities. An act is morally wrong when it would be disallowed by a principle that would make things go impartially best, by a principle everyone could rationally will, or by a principle no one could reasonably reject. This also gives me the conceptual resources to distinguish between moral agents and moral patients. Moral patients are sentient creatures that can be the benefactor of a moral obligation, but they do not themselves have moral obligations. Only moral agents have obligations. So this explains the special duty that we have to humans that we don't have to other non-human animals, because those other non-human animals are moral patients rather than moral agents. How am I for time?
You're just out.
I planned that perfect. That's what a perfect world looks like.
We're now going to turn to 5-minute second rebuttals, starting with Trent. When you're ready, I'll start my timer.
How could it be perfect when more goods are about to be added to it? Well, let's look at Ben's criticisms for my case for the existence of God. He took aim at the argument from motion that's saying you don't need an actualizer for a thing's continuing existence because things could just have existential inertia. Well, there's tons of problems with this. First, existential inertia is not well studied. It doesn't tell us if an ultimate theory is true. Rather, our ultimate theories tell us whether existential inertia is true or not. Paul Audi, in one of the few recent treatments on existential inertia, says it would be most likely to exist if change were simply an illusion. But the second law of thermodynamics, that things tend towards decay, and the fact that you can know a thing's essence apart from its existence counts against the view that objects possess a tendency to exist that doesn't need to be actualized. And finally, using existential inertia against theism argues in a circle by claiming objects merely have a property of continuing existence, and that property exists because of the object whose very existence is invoked to explain it. There's a circular relationship between the substance and the property of existential inertia. And yeah, I would say no, existence and essence are distinct, because I can talk to my son about the essence of horses, unicorns, and triceratops, but telling him the essence of those things will not tell him horses do exist, unicorns never exist, and triceratops once existed. He said my argument committed the quantifier shift fallacy by saying, all chains of a single actualizer, so there's just a single actualizer for every chain. That's like saying every wife has a husband, so one husband has every wife. Good luck, buddy. But I didn't say that. I said my argument shows an actualizer. There just cannot be an infinitely long causal chain. They're not possible, just like you can't have the infinitely long chain of boxcars. So if the infinite chain is not possible, then only the finite chain is possible, and that would include the chain of things like past events or the chain of concurrent actualizers that it ends in pure actuality. Let's talk about the argument from the finite past. Notice that Ben basically conceded the argument can work to show the past is finite. It just doesn't give us theism. But I don't think his arguments here are successful. He says, well, if God creates something from nothing, then God changes. No, that's an extrinsic change. I have a 6-year-old son. One day, he might become taller than me. If he does that, he will change. But when I become shorter than him when that happens, I don't change. It's an extrinsic change. When God creates the world, he doesn't have to move his will. He doesn't have to exercise power units. When God creates the world, the only thing that changes is the world when it comes into existence. He also said that causal finitism can't show that God is perfectly good. I agree with that, but I think the argument from motion can, because goodness and badness are fundamentally about possessing being and privations of being. You know, I have a bad eye because it's missing the color it should have in it, and the proper fluids in here shouldn't be where they are. A bad tree is missing its leaves, it doesn't have water. A bad person might be missing the virtues of justice and charity and things like that. So if goodness and badness are about possessing or lacking being, then if there is a being that just possesses all actuality and existence, it can't be bad in either the non-moral or the moral sense of the word. He said that if God is necessary and he exists, that entails modal collapse. He's using an operator shift fallacy with the word necessary. And I'll show you where that happens. Try this argument. Let's imagine the sun necessarily shined. It just always shined in every possible world. Necessarily, the sun shines. Sunlight is identical to moonlight. Necessarily, moonlight shines. No, that doesn't follow, because the sun could shine before the moon ever came into existence. Just because God's existence is necessary, it doesn't follow that he cannot will the existence of contingent things. Also, by talking about creation of things, he made a fallacy of accident. All mental activity is physical, so we can't have a non-physical creator. Well, as far as we know, all mental activity is carbon-based. But that doesn't mean we couldn't have silicone-based mental activity by other creatures in the universe, or maybe artificial intelligence. When it comes to the moral argument, I would say here, Ben either has to invoke moral Platonism and the idea that these moral truths inexplicably exist out there and bind us, but also which ones do we pick? If they're out there, do we pick the truth of the golden rule, treat others how you want to be treated, or the other golden rule, he who has the gold makes the rules? What makes one true and the other false? What determines that if the statements are just out there? Finally, he said a line I thought was interesting. He said, human equality just exists in every possible world. But Ben can correct us. If his view is that infants do not possess the right to life, then I would say it doesn't even exist for him in this world, this possible actual world. That's my time, and we'll keep the discussion going. Thank you all.
In my opening speech, I made three important claims. First, we saw how naturalism has a higher prior probability than theism because naturalism is simpler than theism. Second, we saw how imperfections are evidence against theism. Finally, we saw how, given classical theism, God's immutability is incompatible with perfect freedom. But what about Trent's case? In my second rebuttal, I laid out several problems for Trent's cosmological arguments. The most devastating of those objections was the gap problem. There is an evidential gap between uncaused cause and perfect being. Neither of these arguments can, in principle, undercut my arguments from evil and imperfection. Trent attempts to fill this gap with his moral reasoning. I provided a rebutting defeater for all these moral arguments by laying out my robustly objectivist view of metaethics. But Trent has also introduced another form of moral reasoning. Trent tries to avoid my argument from imperfection by appealing to the privation theory of evil. I want to argue this view is deeply mistaken. First, even if we concede evil is a privation of goodness and God does not create evil itself, then we must still explain why God allows privation evils to exist. We still have a problem of the missing good. The problem of evil cannot be so easily defined away. Second, the philosopher David Hume famously argued there is a fundamental distinction between how the world is and how the world ought to be. According to Hume's is-ought gap, is and ought statements are two ways of characterizing the world that could not be the same because they are in different, non-overlapping categories of truth. There's a sharp distinction or unbridgeable gap between claims about how things are and how they ought to be. Ought facts, if true, cannot state non-ought truths. Third, if goodness and being are identical, then claiming something is good only states that this thing exists. Such claims, if true, would state trivial facts that could not help us make better decisions, nor to act rightly in any substantive moral sense. Morality, given the privation theory, would be trivial. So let's call this the triviality objection. Finally, this just is not a plausible account of evil because the privation theory is unable to account for certain paradigmatic evils. For example, we cannot reduce the evil of pain and depression to the privation of pleasure or some other feeling. Pain is a distinct phenomenological experience that is positively evil rather than merely not good. The only thing evil about pain on the privation view is that we are not currently in it. Because pain, insofar as it actually does exist, is good for us, and God wills it for us. It's only evil insofar as it lacks something. The evil of pain and depression would be morally indistinguishable from the blank unconsciousness of an oyster. These implications, I think, are very hard to believe, and I want to give an argument against them now, an argument I'll call the agony argument. We all have decisive reasons to want to avoid future pain, like depression. The privation view of evil implies we have no such reasons. Therefore, the privation view of evil is false. How am I for time?
Oh, you're good. A minute and a half.
Minute and a half. So I want to say something about a perfect world. So Trent objected to my argument from imperfection by saying that it's not possible that there is a best possible world. I didn't claim that God would build the best possible world. I claimed that he would build a best possible world. I will concede that we can constantly add good things to a world infinitely. So there may not be the case that there is the best possible world, but God would create a best possible world. Is what a perfect world would look like. Christian theists are already committed to this possibility if they believe in a place called heaven. Heaven is a place where there is no significant freedom, but in which all of the greatest goods are realizable. So my argument is that if there were to be a world created by a perfect creator, it would look something like heaven. This kind of softball is one of Trent's favorite objections. It's called the "why not heaven now" objection. And I'll go ahead and yield any remaining time. Or how much do I have?
20 seconds.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and I'll yield any more time than I have. Thank you so much.
So normally I can just look at the live chat and see how the audience is enjoying it. What do you guys think? So what's unique about this debate is that, and we're going to get to the dialogue soon, trust me. But what's unique about this is that they exchanged opening statements. So I mean that's why you can probably tell there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of content, a lot of substance, and it's because they were sort of working together so that we could make the idea is king here. So let's get into the dialogue. As I was listening to you guys both, I feel like there's maybe two big things that we could try to discuss in this 30 minutes. The first thing might be the gap problem, because it seemed like you were kind of willing to go at least a certain way, a certain amount, but then you've got this gap problem. So maybe we could just discuss the gap problem and then turn to the problem of evil for the second half of it. Sound good? Yeah. So let's start with the gap problem. Why don't you just start?
Yes. Yep. So to remind everyone what the gap problem is, arguments like cosmological arguments and teleological arguments don't give us any moral information about the uncaused cause or the intelligent designer of the universe. And so even if we were to concede these arguments in their entirety and claim that, yes, there is an intelligent designer, an uncaused cause, those could not even in principle undercut something like an argument from evil. Naturalism would still have the hypothesis of indifference. Now, naturalism might be false on that view because there might be this disembodied mind that's incompatible with naturalism, but the gap problem says there's no reason to believe that this being is anything other than indifferent to sentient life. That's the gap problem summarized.
Yeah, well, I guess then what's interesting to me is to the objection that, well, we haven't discovered all of God's attributes. So it's like, hey, you've got 8 out of the 10 divine attributes, but you haven't made your full case. That doesn't seem as compelling to me, because then if I compare, here's 8 attributes of a cause we wouldn't expect on naturalism. So then it would seem to me that while maybe you haven't gotten all the way to theism, you've dealt some body blows to naturalism then. If there is, and especially depending how we define it, because I wasn't sold totally by your definition that it's, well, naturalism is a closed causal system.
Can I jump in here?
Sorry.
The 8 that you were talking about, what are those 8?
I just threw a number out there. Yeah, a
Well,
number.
list just give me like a
yeah,
concrete.
like let's say we get it is immutable, necessary, timeless, immaterial, but so far Ben has just said, well, we don't know if it's good. And my other thought on that is, I do believe that the argument from change does show that this being is good. It can't possibly be bad. And so Ben, you said, well, I don't buy the privation theory of evil, and I don't buy your criticisms of the privation theory of evil. So that's just going to happen.
Yeah.
Because I'm looking at some of the objections there. Like with pain, for example, I would say that pain is, you can describe it as an evil, but sometimes it's a good. Some people choose to run marathons. I don't get it. But apparently, like if I said to a runner, hey, here's a pill, if you run this marathon in Boston, you'll finish and you won't feel any fatigue or soreness whatsoever. I think many runners would not choose that because there is a good in what's being endured in the pain. Now, you might say, well, okay, is there going to be pain in heaven because it's good? No, because I think some goods, when God creates the world, they exist because they are kind of tied to evils. Like, I agree you won't have certain goods related to pain in heaven, just like you won't have certain goods like forgiveness or compassion in heaven, because there won't be suffering or moral wrongdoing. So I guess those are some thoughts there. If you want to throw thoughts back, that's fine too.
Yeah, so I'm not so sure that I'm dealing blows to naturalism by just supposing that your arguments are successful. So I am skeptical of a priori arguments against the existence of a past eternal series of events. I don't think that I think that project of a priori arguments that try to rule that out is just not going to be a successful project. But I think that's largely because of my views about mathematics and Cantorian set theory. However, I don't really have a lot of time to unpack all of those difficult concepts tonight, so I just supposed that but I don't think that deals any blows to my naturalism.
Well, could you give us the definition of naturalism again? Because in your slide, it was essentially a closed causal system.
And that natural reality exhausts causal reality. So I don't think that this is...
But it's hard for me because the term's in the definition. You see, like, naturalism is a closed causal natural reality.
So that we can say that causal reality only consists of natural causes. So naturalism is obviously incompatible with supernaturalism. And so this is one way of cashing out that incompatibility. And
would you be willing to go with, well, Draper's definition was naturalism is the view the physical precedes the mental, and supernaturalism is the view that the mental precedes the physical. Would you be, I would you be willing to go with
Yeah,
that?
I would certainly work with that. I think that's a good working definition that can be modified if needed.
Well, I think that's helpful as well because it gets us out of the circularity problem. But then, if I have an argument that establishes the ultimate cause of reality is immaterial, for example, that would seem to make more sense under the supernatural view than the natural view, though. Do you see how it would?
Well, sure. I think that evidential chips could fall in favor of that. I certainly concede that point. What I would want to say is that the way the evidential chips fall favors naturalism over theism on the total evidence. And so that's the purpose of the Bayesian.
Yes.
Inference.
Can I just say that I loved your little racing analogy?
Really?
That's all I want to say.
I tried to make it as accessible as possible. So I also would like to, so I take your argument for motion to be a demonstration. This is going back to the gap problem. Sorry to help everyone follow along. And so I think that it's significant to say that for cosmological arguments, how do we solve the gap problem? You have to appeal to the privation theory of good to help make that demonstration go.
Privation, evil is a privation of good.
Of good. I'm sorry. Yes. Thank you for the correction. You have to appeal to that view, though, to complete this demonstration. Do I have that right?
Well, I think that I don't think I'm appealing to it. I think I'm trying to make a basic understanding of what it means for things to exist and what it means for them to be good. And I think goodness ultimately has a teleological or end-oriented nature into its definition that would then relate to being. Under classical Thomism, being and goodness are convertible. And I think it does explain with the examples I gave. I would be curious how you would explain, without using privation or being, what the terms like good and bad or good and evil refer to.
Absolutely. So I think that good and bad are reason-implying terms. So I mentioned I believe it was my second rebuttal, or it might have been my first rebuttal, I can't remember, but where I characterized my moral view, saying that these are reason-implying and irreducibly normative. So I don't believe that morality is necessarily teleological, but I do believe that moral properties like goodness and badness are normative.
What about the non-moral sense of good and bad?
Absolutely. So I think those are reason implying too. So I think that contradicting yourself is bad, but maybe not in a moral sense. I think that we should, ought, or must care about evidence or the conclusions of sound arguments. This is non-moral rationality. So I think one of the advantages of my view is that this reason implying sense of normativity can apply both to moral normativity and non-moral normativity. So I have a greater scope of explanation.
So you're saying something is good if it has reasons for it, and just bad if it doesn't have reasons?
Yeah, so I think that the nature of what it's like to be burnt or whipped gives everyone decisive reasons to not want to be in such future states. Mm-hmm. If something is good, then that means that we have some reason to care about it for its own sake. Now, that doesn't mean that these things can't come in conflict with each other, or that certain things can't be used instrumentally.
But then we would have to find a way to decide if the reasons themselves are good or bad reasons. Because we might have reasons, for example, to take fetuses that are not persons and genetically engineer them so they have a desire to be slaves and serve us. And so it would seem to me that under your view, if they're not persons, we can't be harming them, they don't have intentions, and we have reasons for doing something like this. But I would think under my view that has more of a teleological view of understanding what a nature is, ordered towards possessing a certain being, would make more sense under that view than just kind of a broad appeal to reasons in general as to why that would be wrong.
Well, so I think that the central task of moral philosophy is understanding these reason relations. So I think that the fundamental question of moral philosophy is, what ought I do? Well, so that ought implies, or I think, a reason. And so what do I have most reason to do? What would make things go impartially best?
Does that ought imply that there exists a categorical imperative, you ought to do good and avoid evil, that is a fundamental bedrock of the system?
Yeah, so I cash it out in terms, so I have a view in meta-ethics and normative ethics in which a lot of normative theories seem to be in tension with each other. I deny that tension. I think that all of these moral views are climbing the same mountain from different sides. So I think that we can think like consequentialists and say that we have reason to act in ways that would make things go impartially best. I think we can think like Kantians and say that we have reason to treat people in ways that they could rationally will. And I think like a contractualist sometimes in thinking that we should act for reasons in which no one.
But I would say that there is a categorical imperative, not in the sense of a hypothetical imperative, which that's easy to get without theism. If you want X, do Y. I'm talking about that people seem to universally recognize that there is just, you must do X. And I would say that makes more sense under a view of moral obligation imposed by an authority. Even in what you're saying here, I think that description of morality implies the categorical imperative, you ought to figure out how to climb the mountain and not be the nihilist who just sits on the beach and watches Rick and Morty or something like that. Now, I like Rick and Morty, okay, but it is a show that defends nihilism. So for me, I would find it hard under your view to get these kind of categorical imperatives, these universal oughts, things like that, without making them, just their reasons that have their own imperative force, even though they don't have real existence.
Well, so again, I think that they're necessary truths. So I think that they're true in all possible worlds. I mentioned that I don't think that pain is good, intrinsically good, in itself good, in any possible world.
Well, but it can be good under circumstances.
Instrumentally. It might be instrumental in achieving some higher order good, but it is never in itself good. What it's like to be burnt or whipped is never intrinsically good.
Okay, so pain apart from anything else would
Yeah,
just
the
be
nature
bad.
of pain. So I'm an objectivist, so I find the normative value in the object, not in a subject.
So what is it that makes pain bad? Is
The
it
nature
only
of
that
pain.
we don't want it, or that there's something about it that, like there's an absence of good, an absence of something is in pain? Normally that's a sign that an organism is lacking something it needs to properly function.
So it's the nature of pain. So the concept of a reason is difficult to characterize because we cannot helpfully define it using other terms. It's irreducible. So one helpful way, equivalent way of thinking about it is something, we have a reason to do something if this something counts in favor of us responding to it in some way. So pain has a nature, the nature of what it's like to be burnt or whipped counts in favor of us responding to it negatively, of not wanting to be in such a state.
Right, and I agree with you. That's why with my moral argument, I didn't make some kind of broad argument like you can't have objective moral values without God. I was narrowing in on very specific things that I don't think your moral realism will have to bite the bullet on. So did I characterize your view on bioethics and personhood and rights? I don't think I mischaracterized it, that you don't believe in human rights, you believe in person rights.
Yes, so I think that if we're talking about something that has a right, like a serious right to continued existence, I think that's a right that something like a person is going to have. And so I don't think that being a human being is a sufficient condition for being a person. So I think that there are many other types of things that might be able to meet the criteria of being a person. You mentioned earlier the possibility of a synthetic mind. So synthetic minds in the future may well
Right.
be persons.
I agree that not all persons are human, but I do believe that all human beings are persons.
So that
That's a-
raises
that's a
the
separate-
question. Yeah, fair enough.
But what I will
we're
say
getting
this,
deep
let,
in another
let-
topic.
well, let me ask you another question though. Is could someone hold naturalism and the view that all biological human beings are persons and have intrinsic value?
Yes.
Can you have that on natural? Now, I guess, well, here's the thing. You can believe anything on any view. Can you consistently hold it? Because I would say, what is it that makes the case that under naturalism, this particular organism that has certain DNA has a property like intrinsic value, beyond just all of us agreeing that it does?
So I very much concede that a naturalist could be pro-life. So I want to, without getting too deep, too far off topic here, to say that the abortion debate is very controversial. It's a very difficult question. The reason why it persists in the way it does is because there are arguments on both sides. And so I think that there are naturalists who are pro-life, maybe for prudential reasons, maybe for purely political reasons.
I'm asking for philosophical reasons.
Yeah, I'm with you. They would have to defend in how the moral commitments that they had, how that was consistent with their metaphysical naturalist beliefs. And so it's a difficult ethical question and then a further difficult metaphysical question to answer.
Right, and so that's why what I would put forward for people to consider would be, one could maybe make an argument like, if naturalism is true, the biological human equality thesis is false. But if modus tollens, someone believed it was true, that biological human beings both have intrinsic value and they equally possess it in virtue of their species membership, and other species don't have this. And if you think that is more likely to be true than naturalism, then down goes naturalism if you run that path. So
Well,
that's
sure,
why.
one man's
So Ben-
modus ponens is another man's modus tollens.
Let's-
I'll surely concede that.
Can we leave that there and then move to problem of evil? Do you feel comfortable with that?
As
Yeah,
long as you are,
yeah,
I'm
that's
comfortable
fine.
with it.
Okay, yeah, let's discuss that. We're right at about the 15-minute mark. So, yeah, problem of evil, and I'll let you start again and just kind of remind us what
so-
your argument is.
I'll go ahead and recharacterize for the audience, kind of give a brief summary of what it was. So I started with the idea of an argument from imperfection, that if we're starting with the concept of a perfect being wouldn't create anything less than a perfect world. Or are there any reasons for thinking that there are imperfections in the world, such that the world is not as good as it could be? And so I laid out a cumulative case for that. They used 4 different probabilistic methods. So the first one tried to prove that there are these such imperfections. I appealed to the argument from divine hiddenness because my observation that I'm a non-resistant non-theist entails that there is no perfect being. So that is one way in which I can probabilistically prove that there is no God. The second one was an evidential argument from evil that used an inductive method that focused on particular facts about evil, that said these facts are probably an unjustified evil, and an unjustified evil would be an imperfection that's incompatible with a perfect being. And then the final 2 used likelihood judgments about evolutionary evils to then culminate in a Bayesian argument that gave us an argument for naturalism over theism, all things considered.
So Trent, would you like to try to tackle all 4 of those, or would you want to just focus in on one for this time?
Jump around on a few. I don't want to be, we can have a dialogue. I don't need to do like separate rebuttals or things like that. So I have a few questions on some of these. Well, Ben, would a perfect creator create an imperfect world that becomes perfect?
Why?
Because it may be the case that only certain kinds of, if you were to create a perfect world, there are certain goods that would not obtain. And I alluded to this earlier, that you would have certain goods. You might have moral goods like forgiveness, which can't exist without betrayal, courage, which can't exist without danger, compassion, which can't exist without suffering. So it may be the case a perfect creator will make a world, like I was just watching Back to the Future on the plane coming over here. Marty, you need...
I like how he clapped.
Right. Yeah.
That's one of my favorite movies ever.
And, Doc Brown always says to Marty, you got to think 4th dimensionally. And I think sometimes with the problem of evil, we fail to think 4th dimensionally. We think of the world as a snapshot the way it is right now, but the world, especially many scientists, philosophers, is a 4-dimensional block. And so what if the perfect world is one that you have perfection, but part of the block is imperfect, and it goes from imperfect to perfect, so you have all the goods of perfection, and then some goods in the imperfect part you don't have in the perfect part? Why couldn't a perfect creator do that?
Because wouldn't it be better on the whole if it just didn't have those imperfections to begin with? You wouldn't have significant freedom, but you would still realize the greatest goods possible in heaven. God is an infinitely good being. If I'm in heaven in the presence of God, that's the greatest realizable good. That's a perfect world.
Right, but the term perfect world, that's my problem, is that it doesn't seem to be analogous to perfect creator. Like the great making properties that God has, I can conceive of their upper maximum. Like God knows all truths, can do all logically possible things. But then if I think of a perfect world that has all goods, but then the problem is, like I brought up, there are certain goods that become competing, like goods like forgiveness, compassion. I think animals are good. I like animals. I don't want them as pets, but like I enjoy seeing them once in a while. That's why I probably hold the Thomist view. There are no pets in heaven. Any children watching, in heaven you will be perfectly happy. So if you need your pet there, he will be there, but you won't need him.
Sounds like a perfect world.
So that would be my response to that. That perfect world gets hard to define. Well, on hiddenness, your tone seemed to change a bit from saying divine hiddenness makes God unlikely. I thought you said it proved he didn't exist.
I did.
That's a big one. My goodness.
So it's an observation that entails the conclusion.
So your claim is that it is logically impossible for there to be a world with God and people who do not believe in God.
Correct. If I am a non-resistant non-theist, it would be logically impossible for there to be
You're saying God could have no good reasons whatsoever to allow non-belief.
No, he would always be open to relationship. He would be perfectly loving. So a great analogy here is a perfectly loving parent. A perfectly loving parent would ensure that nothing he or she did would put relationship out of reach of their child. God would be for us like a light that always remained on unless we were to close our eyes.
And I am concerned about that analogy. There is a movie that I saw recently. My wife was always
Back
like,
to the
read all these
Future?
philosophy books. Where do you have time to watch movies? Where do you have time to watch movies all the time? It was called Beautiful Boy with Steve Carell, and I forget the other actor. It was based on a memoir about a father and his drug-addicted son. And actually, at one point, his son moves back home, steals from them, keeps his drug habit going. He goes, and then he says, "Dad, can I come home?" And Dad says, "No, you can't, because you haven't changed at all." And he really shuts him out. And that cutting off of the relationship actually forces the son to really take stock of his life and change things. So I'm concerned about the parent analogy there. Also, for me, it's just an odd view of the logical problem, because I think you ran an evidential argument from evil, and most philosophers agree that the existence of evil in God are not logically contradictory, because God could have good reasons for tolerating evil. For me, the ignorance of God is just another kind of evil. So I don't see how it's logically impossible for God to have good reasons to tolerate that kind of evil. And the reason I give is this, so moral evils are not logically contradictory because God allows us free will to make moral mistakes. I don't see why you can't extend the thesis to say God gives us free will to make epistemic mistakes, so that we're free to develop as creatures without God holding our neurons the whole way. I don't see why you can't just shift the argument from evil in that direction.
Right. So I dissent from sort of a popular opinion in the philosophy of religion that I don't think that logical arguments from evil or a logical argument from hiddenness are dead. J.L. Mackie defends one, J.H. Sobel defends one, Michael Tooley defends one, Graham Oppy defends one. I think they're still very much alive and kicking. And I think that you appealed to the free will theodicy, perhaps a free will defense. So I don't think that is a sufficient theodicy. My favorite theodicy is the soul-building theodicy, as Cameron knows. But so like when we look at non-resistant non-theists, something like an isolated non-theist, in what way does the free will theodicy help us here? In what way is an isolated non-theist using their free will to just never come into contact with the concept of a perfect being? Or perhaps someone like a lifelong seeker, someone who looks for God their entire life, uses their free will, but still never finds that.
But here's what I would say, especially when it comes to evils that humans endure. If God exists and he were to love human beings, we might ask, what should God give human beings to show that he loves them? And I might say, well, how about infinite happiness? Happiness that is infinite in nature. So it seems to me if God does do that after we die, then any negative experience we have in this life, when it is added to the infinite amount of happiness we can be compensated with, we will still overall be given that which a loving God would give people. Now, I'm not saying that justifies God doing any willy-nilly thing to us, but that helps things to become sensible, so that conjoined with that is the idea, well, does God have good reasons for allowing non-belief? And then the other problem I have with the divine hiddenness argument is, well, it seems like the vast majority of human beings, God has not been hidden to them. It's more of a relatively recent phenomenon that it seems like nearly everyone has come to recognize that there is a God. I'm not
That's an
saying
interesting
that's a proof.
claim, because Christianity, human civilization predates perfect being theism by thousands of years.
Right, but I think that most people, even many neuroscientists and others, see that human beings have a natural religious sense that I don't think can be purely explained by something like evolutionary biology.
So this is one way, so everyone could have a properly functioning sensus divinitatis. So everyone could have that inner awareness of God, and God could keep that epistemic distance from us, much like a perfectly loving parent could still ensure their child that they are still there and want to love them, while still giving them distance to make.
And I guess what I was looking at.
Let me just jump in real quick.
Oh,
Hold
sure.
your thought. Justin, can we get the microphones down? We're about to head to Q&A in about 5 minutes.
Yeah, and so just my thoughts on the divine hiddenness argument is it's another form it's just a form of the argument from evil. And so, one, we have to understand our epistemic humility. Just because I can't see a good reason doesn't mean that it's not there. So it's like if I look at who's seen the real Mona Lisa? Who's ever seen the real one? Yeah, it's like this big.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay? So you have to get really close to it in the Louvre.
If you can, when I was there was like a huge crowd of.
You know
This
what's
is news to me. I had no idea that Mona
It's
Lisa was that
tiny.
small.
It's tiny.
And don't worry, if it's crowded, you can go to the Pompidou and look at a tire. That's the Museum of Modern Art in Paris. It's terrible. But you go, if I went up to it, I'm like, this is a crummy painting. But if I'm only looking at a tiny part of it, then I'm not able to see the whole picture. Much like, so I think that that's something with the problem of evil one would have to look at. Then when it comes to the problem of divine hiddenness, look, if there are these reasons, I can think of even other reasons. Like, what are some goods God might want to obtain? I'm not saying I even have to prove the goods exist. I think the fact that we know God can tolerate some goods, we can incorporate it here. But some goods I can think of might be the good, for example, of sharing the knowledge of God with other people. I think that evangelism itself, that interpersonal dynamic is a particular kind of good. The good of being able to approach God, and even when you know, like, oh, I could just rationalize it all away because I don't want to believe. I'm not saying that you're doing
That's
this.
fair.
But the ability to be able to freely approach. So each of these reasons may not explain all of the evils, but they give us confidence there are those reasons. Like, for example, when I drive down the road, the highway, I drove you here, and we skirted some red lights when we were trying to get here.
It's not as bad as that, just he made it sound.
Yeah. Oh, you were fine. But if there was a police officer in my rearview mirror, I'm not going to say, wait a minute. The duty I have to other drivers implores me to obey all of these speed limits. It would be the lurking over my shoulder. And so if God made himself obvious, that might take away the good of following him apart from daddy's looking over your shoulder right now. I'm saying that's one possible reason. And I think people wrap their heads around that.
So we've got about 2 more minutes. I just want to let you guys know, you can go ahead and start lining up questions over here for Ben, questions over here for Trent.
So
Wow, look at
you
this.
said something about...
Ben, look at this.
Oh, I thought you said we had 2 minutes.
Yeah, no, we have 2 minutes, but I was just showing you the line, like everybody shot over to your microphone.
Oh, I see what you're saying. I thought you were saying to go up to the podium to answer questions.
You have 30 seconds. That was 10 seconds ago. You now have 15 seconds. 9.
So you said something about the perfection of God being different from the perfection of the world. And so I wanted to see how you responded to the distinction between quantity and quality. So it seems like when we're talking about the perfection of God, we're talking about the quantity of he can do all things. He can know all things. But when we're talking about the perfection of the world, we're talking about the quality of the world, aren't we? We're talking about the maximum quality that something can have. So to use another analogy, we could think of a perfect craftsman creating a perfect craft. Obviously, the perfect craftsman is going to be different from the perfect craft, but we would still expect the craft to be maximum
And what I would say, though, is when we talk about God, because God does not have an essence, God is radically distinct from us, all language is going to be analogical. I'm not equivocating on perfection or being, but we're always going to speak about God in an analogous way. Like how I say, I see you right now, and I see what you're saying. That's the use of the word see in a different though related sense, and I think perfection will apply to God in that analogous way. Second, when it comes to like I understand like a perfect trumpet. I used to play the trumpet. If I was smart, I would have picked the guitar. But in any case, so the perfect trumpet will have the right oiling. It'll meet a certain end. But world is just too vague of a thing in that regard. And also, well, let's take I think this is Parfit's problem or example. Like, which is a more perfect world? One that has X number of people at 100% happiness, or 2X number of people at 99% happiness.
Yeah, the repugnant
conclusion.
Yeah.
And so it seems like, now of course you could say, well, God can make infinite X at infinite happiness, and I would say there's still some goods left. But with world, it's just more amorphous of a concept than like a perfect
So
ball
if we
or
use
something.
the conclusion from the repugnant conclusion, that would pretty much refute theism right now, because the world isn't infinitely full of oysters.
Oh, is that what your philosophy professor said? Or is that what Parfit said?
Yeah, that would.
My professor said that the repugnant conclusion leads to a world of infinite people who eat raw potatoes and listen to Muzak. And if you take one of those things away, they'll kill themselves.
I think he just described hell, right?
All right, so I'm really only standing up because I need to stand up. All right, the way we're going to do this is we're going to start with questions over here. We're going to do 2-minute answer, 1-minute counter response, okay? And we'll just alternate back and forth as long as we can go. And yeah, that's it for about 30 minutes, okay? Just sit back down.
Stay on. Hold it up here.
Oh, and try to keep it to 1 sentence.
Oh man, I can't do that. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But I'll be quick, I promise. So, Trent, in the opening, you said that you compared the materialization of an arm to the materialization of the universe, and you suggested that the weight and the value of witnessing that could be identical to the theoretical transformation of the universe that we haven't witnessed and is completely theoretical. So can you explain that or elaborate on that and tell me why I would use that in my sort of search for God and how that could be something that I put into my equation for that?
Yes, so I have tied that in as an argument from, if the universe came to be from nothing, what would that entail? And I've asked many atheists, what would it take to prove that God exists to you? I think it's a question many atheists have a very difficult time answering. Like, under what circumstances would you believe that God exists? Now, some philosophically informed atheists, I think like Ben would say, a sound argument that leads to a conclusion, which would be nice. Many others don't have that. Many of them will say, well, a miracle. And my option is, well, why a miracle? What do you mean? And I picked healing of an amputated limb, but many other kinds of miracle claims are often, whether it's God written in the stars or knowledge I should not normally have. If I were to say to an atheist, well, why do you believe that God caused that? Maybe that effect or that knowledge just came from nothing instead of God. Because any proposed miracle, I could say, well, it just came from nothing. But if they say, well, no, I wouldn't buy that option, I would take miracle in this rare case because things don't come from nothing, then if we do have a case of something coming from nothing, then I just think they should carry that same intuition over, essentially. I would say if you believe in the lesser miracle, you should believe in the greater miracle, if that makes sense.
Ben?
So I defect from a lot of my atheist peers in saying this, but I think that there are evidential chips that fall in favor of theism. I don't subscribe to the dogmatic claim that there just is no evidence for theism. And so I think one of those chips that falls in favor of theism is a religious experience. Thank you. And so atheists often get asked, what sort of consideration could change your mind? What sort of evidential chip could fall in favor of theism such that you would change your mind? And I think my answer to that would be a cogent religious experience. If I were to have a cogent religious experience, I think that's the evidential chip that would outweigh something like the argument from evil. And I think that atheists should be more willing to reflect and think about ways in which their minds could be changed.
It's good. 54 seconds. Nice.
Thanks.
All right, Gordon, take it away.
Hey, this question is for both. Hypothetically speaking, what would you say to the dyslexic atheist who lies awake at night thinking if dog exists? I'll see myself out.
I would say there's very little cost in believing that dogs exist, and that when you're aware of them, your life might be more improved, either to seek them out or to avoid them. So I would give Horn's wager. Well, I generally believe animals don't go to heaven. I know there's some evidence to the contrary, philosophical arguments, and some, perhaps we could think of them as documentaries about all dogs going to heaven. I don't know. So
I have 5 cats, so I don't know how to answer this question.
Cats don't have souls.
Yeah.
Well, it's disputed among theologians.
Ben, get out. I'm serious. All right, over here.
Trent, I am worried about the validity of your argument from motion, particularly with premise 8. You conclude that from this argument from motion that you get unactualized act, but then that same premise you go on to say otherwise known as purely actual actualizer. I think that is a non sequitur to go from an unactualized act to pure act. There's nothing incoherent about having an unactualized actualizer which still has potencies. How would you respond to this?
Yeah, so what I would say is that the argument entails also that one thing that is actualized in a series is the potential to exist at any moment in that series. And so that would lead to a cause that is at least purely actual when it comes to existence itself. And so if it actualizes existence and everything else in the chain, if its own existence has to be actualized in any way, then it cannot explain the entire chain. It must at least be purely actual when it comes to its own existence. And so in my opening, I said that existence is the most deepest metaphysical fact about something. And so if it doesn't lack anything in existence, it seems contradictory to me that it would have potentials in other kinds of areas, maybe other powers or operations or properties. I would also say if it had pure existence but potential when it comes to activity or operations, that would entail that this cause has distinct parts, and so something would be actualizing its unity to keep its parts together. And so it really wouldn't serve to be the final foundation for all of existence. So I would say that its being pure existence explains why it has no other potentialities and how it could not have other parts of it that are not actualized, because this being can't have any parts at all if it's the most fundamental explanation of reality. That's how I would answer that.
Ben, any thoughts?
Yeah, so I will appeal again to kind of how these pieces don't really seem to fit well together, that we have a problem of coherency here. So my understanding of classical theism, which I'll surely concede Trent's understanding is much deeper than mine, but my understanding of classical theism is that God has no potentials. So distinguishing between active and passive potentials doesn't really help us. God doesn't have any properties. So appealing to something like Cambridge changes. We want to say that God doesn't have any properties, but he has these Cambridge properties where he can change extrinsically. Oh, God is immutable, he can't change, but he can change extrinsically. I think that these cause problems of coherence, that these pieces don't fit well together, and that I would just want to mention that as a supporting claim for my claim that the prior probability of classical theism is low.
Thank you both.
57 seconds, Ben. Good job. I'm really amazed. You're doing good.
I'm just as surprised as you are.
Tim.
Alrighty, perfect. All right, what's up? All right, Ben. So I would love to see or hear your answer to this. I've been musing over this for a little bit. I want to go to your understanding of naturalism that you presented, that the sum total of causal events is simply just natural reality. So all of causal reality is natural reality. I want to step back and ask you a question about the whole thing about cause in the first place. So what about that naturalistic picture actually gives you kind of an epistemic prediction or derivation to think that any natural entity, causal entity, given that we're operating under powers, would actually allow you to epistemically predict that those entities would actually have causal powers? Because it seems that on theism, there's a property or something playing a metaphysical priority here that would allow you to epistemically predict that it does have causal powers. But what about, on your view, allows us to actually have that benefit that would, I guess, put itself on par with theism, that we go, okay, yeah, these entities do have causal powers. It seems that though theism would have the leg up on that, since you look at perfection on perfect being theism and you can just derive that, oh yeah, causal powers. But I don't see how on any naturalistic foundation we'd have that unless you just add that to the hypothesis, but simplicity cost, theism, simplicity gain. What's your response to that?
So I'm not sure I understand the question in what you mean by things having causal powers. So I think that one of the observations, it's a datum that we've both conceded tonight, that there is causation, that there is something like change in the world. And so how I relate that to naturalism and when I characterize it is I appeal to a causal closure thesis. So the idea that something like the conservation of mass and energy is just what is at bottom. There is nothing that comes in that reaches into the world to cause. Now, you said something interesting about theism would give us this kind of causal, some reason to think that there's, causation in the world. Well, theism is plagued by what is known as the interaction problem. So it's this idea that if God is non-physical and the world is physical, how does God reach out and causally affect the world? So I think I would push back that theism explains some feature of causation in the natural world better than naturalism.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah, and I guess my reply would just be, I don't think that the great divider in reality is physical and mental or physical and non-physical. I would say the great divider would be being and non-being and how things participate in being or not. Now, when it comes to the existence of causation itself, I think I would agree. The existence of mere causation could probably go either way between naturalism and theism, but the existence of finite causal chains that require ultimate explanation, the existence of mental causation that affects the physical world, that if human agents are able to make physical causation be rooted ultimately in mental causation, which was part of my argument for moral responsibility in my opening, when a lot of these the nature of causal regularity that effects always proceed from causes in regular ways, I think causation simpliciter, probably equal in either view, but various elements of causation, I think we favor theism.
Time. Yeah, 3 seconds over.
I'm not as good. We lose and the price is right. Went over, Bob.
All right,
Drew.
next for Trent.
Hey, it's great to see both of you all in person. I just had a question regarding, you said that divine hiddenness, you see it sort of like the problem of evil and that the free will defense applies to both. I'm just wondering if you could clarify more on that, because it seems that some people, they're not exactly free to be able to form these beliefs, having belief in God. It seems that there's a sort of lack of control there comparatively to like a decision of doing evil. So, thanks.
Right, so my view is that the problem of divine hiddenness is a subset of the larger problem of evil. So I don't think it should be treated as being dramatically different than the problem of evil. And the problem of evil is just, if God is all good, why does he allow certain evils to exist? And the classical theist answer for that, which by the way, I would also say if this is an evidential argument, if you run demonstrable proofs, then the evidential argument evaporates. So if God exists, if unjustifiable evils exist, God does not exist, unjustifiable evils exist, therefore God doesn't exist, you can run it backwards and just say, well, God exists, so there are no unjustifiable evils. And that'd be running from the other proofs. But, so with divine hiddenness, you might say, well, okay, Trent, but I agree that free will is not going to explain every kind of evil involved in lack of belief, just like free will does not explain every kind of physical evil humans or sentient creatures might undergo. In that case, there might be other reasons that divine hiddenness or non-belief occurs. But my point is that if God exists and he's all-powerful, then we have good reasons to believe that God can always bring a greater good from any evil that exists. And so this argument, the burden is not on me to show these good reasons exist. The burden is on an atheist, because it's an atheistic argument, to show there could not possibly be these good reasons. But if we already have good reason to believe God exists, I don't think atheists can meet that burden.
So I would agree that the argument from hiddenness can be understood as a variation of the problem of evil. But instead of dealing with like the practical domain, it deals with the epistemic domain. So if there's a problem with the way in which people believe in the world, in which knowledge obtains in the world. But there's also an important way in which the argument from hiddenness is distinct from the argument from evil. The argument from hiddenness doesn't make use of any moral claims. So it starts from the conception of perfect love and asks what the entailments are of perfect love. And so one of those entailments I want to argue tonight is that God is always open to relationship. And that's where I gave the analogy of God being like a light that would always remain on. And we must be resisting seeing that light by closing our eyes.
You're cheating. You looked over and saw
I
it.
did. I didn't want to. It caught me.
All right, next for Ben.
I was just looking at you, Cameron.
I know you were looking at this.
So I have a counter argument. Well, I have a counter argument that's about as long as Tim's question to Ben Watkins' imperfection argument. So premise one: God does not have to create the most perfect world. Perfect being theism implies libertarian free will or some compatibilistic free will. We can discuss that. Premise two: God only has to create a world that is more perfect than the most imperfect world. Premise three: we are not in the most imperfect world. Therefore, we are in a world that can be created by a perfect being. And BTW subscribe to Wolves Doe Apologetics since, you're around here.
So I would start off by asking the question, why would a perfect creator create anything less than a perfect world? That doesn't seem to follow if we assume that God is omnipotent and morally perfect. So if we assume that God is omnipotent, he is not constrained by anything other than logical limitations. So he can do anything of which the description is coherent. And if he's morally perfect, then he's going to make the world go impartially best. He's going to treat everyone in ways they could always rationally consent, and he would never act in ways that were unjustifiable to others or in ways that someone could reasonably reject. And so when I think you reflect seriously on the moral implications of this, your first premise there seemed to be that God would create less than a perfect world. And so I would want to press on that and say, but why? It would be, if such a being existed that didn't do that, it would obviously be greater than that being. And so if we're starting with the concept of God that is wholly worthy of our worship, it's going to be the greatest possible being. And it seems like your first premise just denies that God is the greatest possible being, because God could create a world in which everyone freely chooses right. Such a world could look like heaven.
Am I allowed a counter, or is it? No, it's
No, we're sorry. We gotta get a response from him, and then we gotta move on.
Yeah, and so I think this is going to go back to the central question of what does it mean for something to be a perfect world? You brought about qualitative or quantitative things. It seemed like what I gleaned from your definition of a perfect world is just one that is free from pain, for example. Because one could argue if God simply just makes it's him and an electron orbiting a nucleus of an atom, is that a perfect world? Well, it certainly doesn't have pain, doesn't have any bad things, but it's also lacking a lot of good things too. So I would say that if God he's the perfect being, when God creates, you're right, he doesn't do logical contradictions, but I would also say he doesn't do ontological contradictions. So God won't create a world where I am safely courageous, a world where I am forcibly loving other people. So just to get those kinds of goods without evils connected to them. So I don't think it's a feasible term, just a perfect world, John. I think God just has an obligation to make a good world.
Time. All right. Next, Jeremy.
All right, for Trent. I'd like to dig into divine hiddenness as well. So I think that someone can look at a certain body of evidence and come to the conclusion that God does not exist, or perhaps agnostic is a tenable position to hold, and be reasonable in that effort, so not far out in left field. So I'm not looking at Ben and thinking he's completely crazy, necessarily. But I was wondering if you agree with that assessment, and then...
Wait, what assessment? That people can look at evidence and reach different conclusions?
And reach a conclusion that God does not exist in a reasonable manner. And then does that circumstance decrease the probability that God exists?
Well, I think that people can, in general, be reasonable individuals, but if they reach a false conclusion, they will have made some error in their reasoning along the way. I don't think it is not possible to only grasp true premises and perfectly reason and then end up at a false conclusion. But just because someone might err in their reasoning, it doesn't mean that they are some kind of an unreasonable person. And so once again, as I said before, that if God allows us moral freedom to develop as beings, he might also allow us epistemic freedom. He might give us freedom to pursue goods. He also gives us freedom to pursue truths. Because you might say, well, if God makes his existence obvious, maybe he should make other truths obvious to us. Why should we have to learn any truths? Maybe God wants us to go through the goodness of learning those truths on our own. And then finally, I would say that these kinds of arguments, once again, if you have a proof like the argument from motion or something, or even the argument from morality, you would just get to the conclusion, well, God does exist, and then there must be some reason he does not make his existence obvious, but if he is fully good, he will compensate those who have not come to know his existence in this life. And then there's more on the parent analogy, but I don't want to overstep my time. You got 30 seconds. Okay. Yeah, I would just say, look, when we speak of God, we cannot speak of him univocally as being the exact same as a human parent, for example. So there are many things that I do when I treat my own children. For example, like adults, we treat adult children far differently than infant children. So it doesn't mean just because a parent of an infant child will treat their child one way, doesn't mean they'll treat an adult child the same way. So there are going to be differences, and then ultimately when we apply that to God, who is all-knowing, he is able to achieve goods with his power and knowledge that we're not aware of.
So I want to say that I agree that we can disagree about what the evidence has. We can have apparent reason to be atheists, and we can have apparent reason to be theists. And this kind of shows how the problem of divine hiddenness shades into the problem of widespread religious disagreement. I mentioned earlier how I thought that religious experiences was an evidential chip that fell in favor of theism. But the idea that there's this widespread disagreement, there's multiple different kinds of incompatible religious experience, is surprising given theism. If we're conceiving of a God that cares about us and what we believe and predicates something like our salvation on what we believe, I think that widespread disagreement is surprising.
Thank you both.
Next question for Ben.
Yes, fantastic discussion, guys. It was great. You know I was coming for you, Ben. So if there's a problem of evil for the theist, there's also a problem of good for the atheist. But it seems like on the problem of evil, it is easier to have an ontology or the intrinsic value of being able to ground that goodness for theism, but on atheism or naturalism, there doesn't seem to be anything at all or any intrinsic probability of anything that we can ground it in unless it's something ambiguous.
So I would disagree that there is a problem of good on naturalism. So I am a moral realist. However, that is a controversial position within my camp. There are many philosophers whose opinions I very much respect who are not objectivists. They are anti-realists about morality. So the problem of evil is unique because it's a tension that arises because of God's attributes and observations we observe in the world. So we can take an argument from evil and Morian shift it. So one man's modus ponens is another man's modus tollens. And so we can say that the argument from evil and something like a moral argument can kind of play off of each other. And so what we're trying to ask really is, what's more plausible, that there are some unjustified evils in the world, or that something like moral realism implies theism? These are, we can use the forms of these arguments to narrow it down to these two theses. And I think that the weight of evidence clearly falls on the side of there being unjustified evils, and I defended tonight a secular, robust, objectivist view of morality. So I would deny that moral realism implies something like theism.
Yeah, and I would just say I disagree with its robustness, and many other atheists that I've cited don't see it that moral truths having existence beyond just scientific datum doesn't have that explanatory power. Though I would also say that just because we aren't aware of reasons for things, even in very unusual circumstances, like, well, if X is true, we'd expect Y. We don't get Y, so we don't get X. We have to look at all the factors. To give an illustration, if I go to a decrepit, abandoned house that's got moss and weeds and bugs, and I might think, wow, I look at all of this, I would expect that no person would live here. And if somebody lived here, that wouldn't make sense. But suppose I walked in and I found a piping hot cup of tea inside of this house. Even if I might think, why would anybody be here? The fact that the piping hot cup of tea, it now outweighs the very strange circumstance of being in the decrepit house. So I think when we look at the evidential argument from evil, we have to look at all of the background knowledge, and everything that points towards God is even if you thought it's just so bizarre God would make a world like this, yes, but it's also bizarre if there's a piping hot cup of tea and nobody around.
Time. I kind of lost my train of thought. So
would you like some tea?
I need some more. I need some more, really. Okay, I think we have time for 2 more questions, so one from each side. So sorry, everyone else, including especially you, John.
I still love you, John.
You can talk to them at any point, literally.
That's my question.
What?
What?
Who created God? Is that your question?
John, sit down.
I think that means I win the debate now, right? I'm pretty sure.
That's what that means. All right, so last question for Trent.
Hello, Trent.
Howdy.
So my question has to do specifically with, so obviously you presented like a deductive argument for God. So my question just has broadly to do with like deductive arguments in general. So obviously your argument presented a lot of premises in the argument, right? But it seems like a lot of the premises, not all of them, but a large majority of them seem to depend upon a particular view of metaphysics, right? In this case, Thomistic views, or maybe it doesn't. You can help clarify. But my point is that you have to assume that particular metaphysics, right? So you have to actually show why we should prefer that view of metaphysics over some alternative naturalistic view. And so my question, just more broadly, is shouldn't we be comparing Thomism with like naturalism and like saying, okay, shouldn't we look at the theoretical virtues of the views rather than just presenting deductive arguments?
Well, okay, so the question is then if I, is my case being less probable because I have a very specific kind of explanation of the world based on the thought of Thomas Aquinas, the argument from change, versus just naturalism? I think, though, that either view will succumb to this problem because everyone has to answer these questions. The naturalist has to explain change as well. The naturalist has to explain how do we have immaterial properties in a material world, things like qualia, other things like this. So I would say, though, that in my deductive argument, I didn't just merely assert these metaphysical principles. I talked about what change is, its potential reduced to actual. I gave examples of that. And I don't think that anyone who denies that metaphysic, they might describe change in a different way, but they won't explain it in a different way. Now, I agree that you can define the terms more, but with any deductive argument, when you are pressed, like, does it mean, like in the Kalam argument that William and Craig makes, whoever begins to exist as a cause. Oh, yes, but what does it mean to begin to exist? So you're always going to you can define the terms more carefully according to your own metaphysic. Everyone will have to defend their own metaphysic, and I think in the argument from change, I provided examples where the basic feature of change, act, and potency are intelligible concepts.
So I think this is one area where my view is going to have something of an advantage because there's been what's known as scientific paradigm shifts. So during the Enlightenment, there was a scientific paradigm shift away from the Aristotelian way of thinking about the world and towards a clockwork kind of universe. And now we have a paradigm shift again in physics that uses a conservation of momentum, the idea that things are in motion until something comes and acts and stops them from being in motion. So you'll notice that in the current paradigm, things like act and potency aren't concepts that are used. So I would say that I supposed Trent's paradigm tonight for the sake of charity so that we could have these interesting conversations. But I would also say that I'm skeptical of the classical theist Aristotelian paradigm. I think we have shifted away from it.
57, if you were wondering.
I was wondering.
All right, last question for Ben.
Excuse me, sorry. I appreciate both of your guys' talks. I think you both presented your cases well, and I'm just thankful that I get to be here to learn more about how to defend my faith. So, Ben, my question for you, you stated earlier in the discussion that naturalism entails indifference to sentient life, yet later when you lay out your moral framework, I know there's not enough time to lay out your entire moral framework, but under naturalism, why does personhood or persons matter? Like, what is the underlying, I guess, so in the, theistic camp, maybe more of the Abrahamic faith, we have the idea of the Imago Dei, as you know, where people are endowed with certain, like Trent mentions, like we're made in the image of God, so we have intrinsic worth. So where does that, I guess, intrinsic worth, or how would you describe that in naturalism?
Right. So the question I take it to be, what gives human persons their kind of moral status?
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the distinctions I drew earlier in the debate is between a moral patient and a moral agent. And so I think there's at least two features of human persons that make us morally relevant. The first is our capacity to feel pain. And so this is what we share with other moral patients. We all have the capacity to suffer. I have also claimed that the nature of suffering and pain is in itself bad. So this is a way in which we have intrinsic value. We can suffer. The other way in which we're morally relevant is we are rational animals. We are capable of appreciating and responding to reasons in the world. Just like cheetahs were selected for speed and giraffes were selected long necks, we were selected for our abilities to respond to reasons in the world. And so our rationality is what makes us morally relevant. It's what makes us moral agents. It's what allows us to recognize and appreciate something like a moral obligation. So I think that this challenge can be met by just appealing to one, the capacity to have conscious experiences such as suffering, and our rationality, the ability to appreciate and respond to reasons and understand duties and what we owe to each other.
And my reply is I don't believe this coherently solves the problem. On the one hand, we're told under naturalism, the universe is indifferent to sentient life. Yet there are also these necessary moral truths that say we ought to care about sentient life in every possible world, which seems like a contradiction to me. We're also told, well, human beings have intrinsic value because they can suffer, but any sentient being can suffer. That doesn't explain why humans' their unique suffering matters more than other creatures. And then it doesn't explain how, for example, let's take an infant, a human infant. It is not a moral agent, it is a moral patient, the same way a dolphin, a pig, or a pigeon might be. And yet we would recognize it as a moral patient that has unique rights, and I would say not merely by a prudential, conventional judgment, but in virtue of its nature. And I would say I don't see what can explain biological human nature having value apart from some source of value creating it.
All right, let's move into closing statements. Sound good? Why don't we just do it from the chairs? Sounds good.
In Catholicism, we call that ex cathedra.
Can we? I'd rather use the podium.
You want to use the podium?
I'd rather use the podium.
Why?
Do you have
you feeling fancy? Oh, no.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I'm going to read.
That means mine's infallible.
All right, let me move this thing back. All right, Trent, go ahead. 5 minutes.
Why are you going to use the podium? I want to create symmetry, I guess. All right. So, takes the pressure off. Right, so I left my phone. I don't have a good internal chronometer like Ben has. I'll say, well, just to recap, think of the cases that we both presented tonight. I presented two cosmological arguments that show the universe has a transcendent cause to its existence, and that this cause has divine attributes, and also a moral argument that shows that whatever this ultimate cause is, it would also be a perfect standard of goodness that explains moral facts that naturalism cannot explain. So when we look at Ben's arguments, we could say, well, did he show that God does not exist? I would say no, he did not. He tried to show contradictions in the case for classical theism. You could just be a regular old theist if you want. Or I showed those contradictions don't obtain because Ben is using ambiguous terms to create contradictions that don't really exist there. So I think his logical case for there not being a God doesn't work. I also don't think his evidential case for God not existing did not work. He tried to point out various kinds of evils that exist, non-belief, suffering, things like that. But I showed that he did not meet the burden of showing that the God who created the universe, which I believe my arguments did show tonight, is incapable of having reasons to justify that. Rather, I would say Ben's naturalism simply cannot explain the things that my case was able to put forward tonight. Now, as to his objections to my arguments, he alleged they committed various fallacies, like a quantifier shift fallacy or a gap problem. I think I showed they did not do that. And even if you are not convinced that they describe every single attribute of God, I think if you are a naturalist who does not have a circular definition of naturalism, but you hold that naturalism just means the physical always precedes the mental, and there is no ultimate mental foundation of reality, if all my arguments essentially show there is at least an immaterial cause of reality, something that is not physical, then that's going to put your naturalism on life support. And I think the other arguments will pull the plug on it. So I not to be grim about it. They're hypotheses. We can abuse positions, not people. I always believe this. You should always, some people tell me, Trent, shouldn't you respect everybody's opinion? I say, no, some opinions are stupid, or they're evil. But you should always respect people, because people have intrinsic worth and value, even if they haven't developed the capacity to have opinions yet. So that's why I think I was happy with this debate, that we can show no matter what, we should go out. You don't have to respect people's opinions. You might think they're wrong and they need to be refuted. But you can always respect the person who has that opinion and dialogue with them. And I hope that at the very least this debate will encourage people to continue this dialogue. I mean, when I do debates on the existence of God, I don't expect that we will end the question. My goal is to begin the question for many people who might be watching this for the first time, and I believe is the most important question that we can ask as human beings. Why am I here? What ought I to do? And what is my ultimate end? And I think the case I presented tonight shows that we are created by a perfect God who is unlimited, and that ultimately Revelation shows us this God loves us and desires eternal life with us. So thank you all so much, and I hope you have a good evening.
I want to start by giving my sincerest thanks to Trent for being such a wonderful interlocutor tonight. And I want to thank Cameron for not only inviting me, but also for being such a wonderful moderator. In Trent's opening statement, we saw at least two cosmological arguments. We saw the argument from motion and an argument from causal finitism. Regarding the argument from motion, we saw at least two undercutting defeaters in the form of my existential inertia thesis and the quantifier shift fallacy. What about causal finitism? We saw that even if we concede the universe is finite, this fact is not sufficient to get us to classical theism. We saw how the doctrine of creation ex nihilo is incompatible with immutability and timelessness. We also saw how a necessary cause of the universe would modally collapse the distinction between necessity and contingency in the universe, implying modal fatalism. We also saw how the gap problem, the physical dependence of minds, divine hiddenness, and facts about evil are rebutting defeaters for inferring a perfect and personal cause of the universe. Finally, Trent gave at least three moral arguments that are supposed to be reasons to believe naturalism is false and that theism is closer to the truth. I argued these moral arguments are mistaken because naturalists can accept the robustly objectivist view of morality that I laid out tonight. I argued that some things matter in a moral sense because we all have reasons to care about these things for their own sake, and that some of these reasons are moral reasons because they are weightier than any other competing reasons we may have. This model of meta-ethics can account for the intrinsic value of persons, the moral wrongness of our acts, and the special moral duties that moral agents have, but moral patients lack. This gives us rebutting defeaters for all of Trent's moral arguments. We saw how basic moral truths are necessary truths. Because facts about intrinsic value, moral wrongness, and the distinction between moral agents and moral patients are necessary truths, it follows these truths are not evidence either for naturalism or for theism. In my opening statement, I laid out at least 3 arguments for naturalism. The first was that naturalism is simpler than theism because it is more modest and coherent. The second argument I gave was undoubtedly the most important, the argument from imperfection. This argument is a cumulative argument that appeals to at least 4 probabilistic claims. The first is that non-resistant non-theists prove there is no perfect being. The second is that particular evils are evidence theism is probably false, all things considered. The third is that evolutionary evils are more likely giving naturalism than theism. And the last is that evolutionary evils are evidence for naturalism over theism, all things considered. My final argument was the argument from freedom. We saw how, by definition, God's immutability is incompatible with perfect freedom. So the conjunction of classical theism and perfect being theism is impossible. Trent also appealed to the privation theory of evil as a rebutting defeater for my arguments from evil and imperfection. We saw this view is mistaken for at least 4 reasons. The first was that this move doesn't actually solve the problem of evil because there is still a problem of the missing good. Second, we saw how Hume's is-ought distinction undermines the claim that goodness and being are identical. Third, we saw how identifying goodness with being implies morality is trivial. Finally, we saw how this just isn't a plausible view of evil because it cannot account for paradigmatic examples of evil like pain and depression. Taken together, I think we have much more reason to prefer my robustly objectivist metaethics to the privation theory of evil. My main contention tonight is that something like metaphysical naturalism is much closer to the truth than Trent's classical theism. To use the metaphor from earlier, naturalism wins the evidential race. This conclusion will have some unwelcome implications for many people. For starters, it implies there's no life after death, no eternal salvation, and no perfect being to have a meaningful relationship with. I recognize that these implications may seem unacceptable to many in the crowd tonight and watching at home. So the best advice I can leave you with is to let evidential chips fall where they may and to proportion your beliefs to the evidence as you see it, because we all have nothing to lose and everything to gain from an honest pursuit of truth. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for this platform for Trent and I to raise the level of discourse in these kinds of discussions. I am proud to call each and every one of you my friends, and in the words of my late grandfather, you are all wonderful people. Please be safe, and cheers.
All right, I think that's it. I think we're done. The debate is over. So tomorrow morning we start at 8 a.m. with Dr. Cy Gart. He's presenting evidence for God from biology, and I'm really excited about that. I think you guys are too. It's time for me to rest my voice and get some sleep, and you guys need to get some sleep too, so we can be back and ready to go, because it's going to be amazing. It's going to be a long day. It's going to be awesome. But thank you guys for coming out. Thanks again to our debaters. Awesome. Awesome. Yeah. So good. And we'll see you guys tomorrow.
Very good. That'll be a textbook one for people to watch.
Yes.
Classical theism and philosophical atheism. I think people will be able to learn a lot studying.
Yeah. You're shaking?